We'll do a review now of the second siman, the second sicha in the Devar Malchus that the Rebbe distributed, discussing the topic of Moshiach that were printed in the Rebbe's sichas. This sicha is in volume 34, Lamed Daled, in the sicha of Shoftim. And this sicha discusses the nitzchiyos, siman beis nitzchiyos havtochas hageula, the eternity of the promise of the geula. The sicha, the Rebbe discusses details in the Rambam in Perik Yud Aleph, and the Rebbe points out the Rambam's view that believing in the coming of Moshiach is a Torah command in the stories of the Torah. It is a prophecy, but it is also, in addition, and more so, it's a mitzvah. It's part of a mitzvah. As far as the eternity of Torah, when we talk about a mitzvah has the most lasting and literal translation. And therefore, as the Rebbe explains, the Rambam says that believing in Mashiach covers all aspects. It's a story of the Torah tells us about it. It's a prophecy in the Parshas Bilam. And the Rambam writes in a separate halacha that this is part of the mitzvah of Orei Miklot. And Orei Miklot as a mitzvah means that this could never be changed. And it means literally, the mitzvah literally. And that's what's added in Halacha Beis in the Rambam by bringing it in a separate, special halacha, the mitzvah of Orei Miklot, which is part of that mitzvah, is the coming of Mashiach, when there will be the additional 3 Orei Miklots, as the Pasuk says. And the Rebbe also brings out there is also a certain level of strength by saying that this is also from prophecy, as the Rebbe will explain throughout the Sikha. But first, let's learn inside Ois Aleph. So the Rebbe quotes from the Rambam, Kosav HaRambam B'Hilchos Melachim. So the Rambam in the Laws of Melachim writes, HaMelech HaMoshiach Osid Lamid, King Moshiach is destined to stand up. Ulahachzir Malchus Beis David Liyoshna v'chulu, and he will bring back the kingdom of the house of David to its old status. V'chulu. By the way, the previous halacha, the Rebbe has a few different. The Rebbe mentions some of the same questions, but the Rebbe gives a little bit of a different twist over here, in addition to what we learned in the first sicha. The first part, the Siman Aleph of the Devar Malchus. Further, the Rambam says, "V'chol mi she'enoi ma'amin boi," anyone who doesn't believe in Moshiach, oy mi she'enoi machake libiyosoi, or one who doesn't look forward to, anticipate his coming, loy b'shar neviim bilvad hu kofer, isn't only denying the other prophets, as the Rambam will says later on. In the Nevi'im, it's full of the prophecy of Mashiach. So, of course, we would know that if one doesn't believe in Mashiach, he would be denying all the other prophets. But here the Rambam is saying it is not only the other prophets alone that he is denying, but rather in the Torah and Moshe, our teacher. How is it from the Torah? Because it's a Torah that talks about it. Shahadei HaTorah hi'ida olav. The Torah testifies on him about Moshiach. Shenemar. So first he brings the Parsuk of Nitzavim, in which Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Yidden that eventually the Yidden will return to Hashem and they'll do teshuvah. And then he says, V'shov Hashem elikecha es shavuscha v'richamecha. God will return your return and have compassion on you. V'shov v'kibetzcha v'goymer. And he will, once again, he will return and he will gather you in from all places. If you will be pushed away at the edge of the heavens, which means wherever a Yid will be in Golus, even the furthest places, Hashem will bring you. So the general concept that there will be a return, that the Yidden will come back from Golus, is very, very clear in the Pasuk, in this Parsha of Nitzavim, in which the Torah talks about Hashem will bring back and return you, and he will gather you from there. And if you are even at the edge of the Shamayim, Hashem will bring you back. The Rambam further says that the Elu Hadvarim HaMefurashim BaTorah, these words, which are very clear in the Torah, so it's in a general way, they include in a general way all the words that were said through all the prophets. So as we have in all the prophets, the various different details of what's going to take place, in the Torah it's included in this sentence in which it says God will bring you back. Then the Rambam goes that there's an additional proof. As the Rebbe explains now, this only tells us that there will be a gathering of the Yidden back into Eretz Yisrael, but it doesn't say who's going to do that. So the Rambam further brings down that Av Parshas Bilam Nemar, also in the portion of Bilam it's written, but Visham Nibe B'Shnei HaMashiachim, over there he prophesies about two Mashiachim, which means basically, as this was the Rebbe's a lot discussed in the previous ois, that we had a Moshiach which was David HaMelech, and we have the Moshiach HaAchrein, which is Moshiach Tzidkeinu, Melech HaMoshiach. And in the prophecy of Bilam, he prophesizes about both of them. As the Rebbe explained the whole idea of this in the previous Sikha, that he's going to bring back what was lost after the King David that we wanted to Golus. But in any event, there is a Shom Niba B'Shnei HaMashiachim. But Mashiach HaRishon Shehu David, the first Mashiach, which is David, who helped the Yidden in the beginning, Chulu. But Mashiach HaAchrein Shem in the bone of Chulu, and the last Mashiach, the Mashiach Tzidkeinu, and maybe come a psukim in Parshas Bilam, and he brings several psukim from the portion of Bilam, which is the prophecy that Bilam told to Balak at the end before he left, and he didn't succeed in trying to curse the Bnei Yisrael. So then he says, Umefarsham, and the Rambam explains how this prophecy of Bilam al David Melech HaMashiach, al King David Melech HaMashiach. So that's the two proofs. In this proof we already see that this is Mashiach. We're not just talking about somebody is going to stand up, but there is going to be a Mashiach in the end of days, Mashiach Achrein, as the Rambam discusses from the portion of Bilam, Dorach Koichav Miyakov, V'kom Shevet Misrael, how each of these psukim on David and Mashiach. So now we have two proofs basically. So one proof tells us that Mashiach, that there will be a Geula, there will be a gathering. The other proof tells us that there's going to be a Mashiach. But then in a separate halacha, the Rambam writes, "V'loch shlach as a mamshech Rambam." The Rambam continues, "Ab ba'orei mikla tu oimer." Also by the cities of refuge, there's another pasuk over there. The pasuk says, Torah talks about that they separated the three orei miklot on the other side of the Jordan River and on the Eretz Yisrael side of the Jordan River, 3 and 3. And the pasuk says there, "Im yarchiv Hashem elekecha es gevulcha," that if Hashem will widen your territory, meaning the land of Israel will increase, it'll become bigger. So then you need additional orei miklot. V'yosafta lecha oid shalosh orim v'gomer. Then you should add additional 3 cities. So why would the Torah be telling us that you will need an additional 3 cities if it never happened? It never happened, this thing. Hashem would not instruct in vain, without a purpose, because if it's never happens, so why is Hashem giving us a mitzvah to add another 3 cities? So therefore, we must say that the Torah is basically telling us over here that there will come a time when Yarchiv Hashem Elokecha is Gevulcha, and then you will add these 3 cities. So this is another proof from the Torah that there will be the time of Moshiach, the Geula, and then there will be additional cities added to the cities of refuge. The Rambam concludes, in the Halacha Beis, but we don't need proof that the prophets, because all the books of the Nevi'im are full with this concept. So we need to look in, what is missing in the first evidence that we bring down originally, from the Pasuk, V'shov Goimer, that Hashem will return Sheva Parshas Nitzavim, which is in the portion of Nitzavim. Parshas Bilom, and the portion of Bilom talks about Moshiach. Shahuska Rambam Lahoisif Harayeh, that the Rambam required to bring down additional added proof. Gam Hakosu Borei Miklat, also from the Pasuk Borei Miklat. The Rambam is not just trying to pile up additional places of the Torah. Must be a reason that the first 2 prophecies aren't sufficient for him. And here the Rambam comes up with an additional, what is lacking? And as the Rebbe will say later on, and he places it not as a follow-up to the first 2 in Halacha Aleph, but rather he starts Halacha Beis, gives this in its own Halacha, which is also very meaningful, as we know that the Rambam is actually precise, as we'll see. As Rebbe explains now, the need for the 2 first evidence is understood. What is the Rambam intending over here in the laws of Malachim? He is talking about the belief on King Moshiach, not talking about just that there is going to be the Geula, but the Rambam wants to actually say that there is going to be a Melech HaMashiach. Hainu, which means to say, in addition to the obligation that we must believe in the general concept of redemption, that Hashem would redeem in the future all of Israel, and that wouldn't matter how it's going to take place, through Moshiach or otherwise. But there is the Rambam wants to bring that over here. So that is in addition to believing that somehow the Yidden will go out of go, however is going to happen. It is also a specific obligation. You have to believe that there is going to be a King Mashiach. Together with the details of the special aspects and the greatness that are detailed in the Rambam in this chapter. That's a part of our belief. Rambam, as the Rambam's precise language is, anybody who doesn't believe in him. It's not Chol Mishein Mamin Negula. Chol Mishein Mamin Boy means if you don't believe in Moshiach. So that means that The Rambam here wants to bring evidence that there's going to be Moshiach, not that there's going to be the Gula. And that v'davar zeh eine mefurish b'posuk. That's not clear in the verse. It's not articulated. V'shov Hashem elikecha shvuscha. Over there says, God, your God. God will do it. It doesn't say Moshiach. V'kibetzcha v'viyacha Hashem. Actually, it says Hashem will do it. It doesn't say Melech HaMashiach, through Melech HaMashiach. Elarag b'parshas Bilom. But it's only in Parshas Bilom where we have the evidence. Sheshom niba b'shnei HaMashiachim. Over there he talks about the two Mashiachs. David and Melech HaMashiach. So over there, so from there we have the evidence that there'll be a Melech HaMashiach. And because the Rambam wants to prove that it's talking about Melech HaMashiach, not just, doesn't just say, it talks about Shnei Mashiachim. It shows you in the Pasuk how it's talking about two Mashiachim, so that there is the Mashiach, Melech HaMashiach. Maybe, Gam Arichas Harayim. So for this reason, he also brings the prolonged, the proof in Kama V'Kama Psukim, Hamidabrim Bazeh Bahem, with many verses that speak of them. Ki b'psukim elu nirmozim gam prote inyonov u'ma'aloisov shel Melech HaMashiach. Because in these psukim we also hint the details of the special aspects and the greatness of the Melech HaMashiach. And that's because the Rambam, because this is all part of believing in Melech HaMashiach, we have to believe in that. As we explained elsewhere, as the Rebbe explained, that these are the four aspects of Mashiach in the first Sikha that we learned, the first part of the first Devar Malchus, and therefore the Rambam brings all the details. This is all a hemshech to believe boy and of his aspect. So that's why the Rambam has to bring down the psukim from Bilam in order to prove that there's Melech HaMashiach, not just Geula. Why does the Rambam not just bring the prophecy of Bilam and also needs to bring the Parsha of Nitzavim? Uliidach, because in the Parshas of Bilam, the Nevuah of Bilam, over there it's not clear. It's just sort of encryptic. It's Torah Koichav Miyakov V'Kov Shevi. One can argue on the interpretation. You need the interpretation of Chazal to solidify that it's Melech HaMashiach. So the first pasuk is very clear about the Geula. The second pasuk adds that it's Mashiach, but it's not as strong because it's not so clear. So between the two of them, the Rambam brings both proofs. The other hand, he wasn't satisfied with the proof from the portion of Bilam. Not only was he not satisfied, he only brings it as the second proof. The Rambam's intention over here is not just to being proof of that in the Torah Shebiksav we have the coming of Moshiach, which means the way the Torah Shebiksav is interpreted by the Chazal. This says about that there's going to be Mashiach. But the Rambam wants to prove more than just that there is such a thing as the coming of Mashiach. But the Rambam wants to say not only that we see in the Chazal that he's going to come, but that if you don't believe in him, you are denying the Torah. Koifer b'Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, you would be denying the Torah, and Moshe Rabbeinu shalai Torah Allah, because the Torah testified about him. We can't say the Torah testified about him very clearly in these psukim because ba'edus hazu ein rak al pirush psukah Torah shebetorah shebal peh. The testimony from this psukim of the Parshas Bilam isn't from the Torah itself. It's only according to the interpretation of the verses of the Torah by the Torah shebal peh. So it's not, can't say the Torah either. So the truth is, Shagam HaKoifer V'Perusha V'U Torah Shebal Peh, one who denies that the Rambam writes elsewhere, the one who denies the commentary of the Torah, which is the oral Torah, ubichlal kofer b'Torah. He is part of kofer b'Torah. So true that it's kofer b'Torah, but we want to tell us over here not that he's kofer in the divrei Chazal, which would be a kofer b'Torah. We want to say that the Torah itself. We want to say Eloelu hadvarim hamuforoshim b'Torah. We want to say that he's kofer in the things that are very clear in the Torah. So the Rambam can't bring just the pasuk from Bilam, v'ilu nevuos Bilam nemru b'derech moshel v'chida, because the prophecy of Bilam were said in a way of a example, in a way of a riddle. B'lashon she'efsher loymar, it's such a language you can't say about this advarim hamuforoshim b'Torah, that these are the words that are explicit. They're not explicit in the Torah. They are metaphorically, they are in a riddle. So the Rambam can't just bring down because this pasuk, because he wants to say that this is very, very clear. But in the first pasuk, where it says the Geula, Kibbutz Goliath v'chulu, the gathering of exiles, so over there it's very clear. So in order to substantiate that it's a very clear denial of the Torah, the Rambam has to bring the first pasuk of the Geula in general. But that doesn't tell us about Moshiach. So for the coming of Moshiach, we have the interpretation of Chazal in the prophecy of Bilam, which is part of the Torah, and that becomes a part of the Torah. So he needs that second proof from Moshiach and the first proof for its clarity. What we need to explain as above, what is added through the pasuk about the Orei Miklot? Why? What's missing in the first two proofs? And Gam Yesh Ledayik also that we can ask over here is to point out that the Rambam Kosav Rayezu Ba'alocha B'fnei Atzma. He wrote this evidence in its own halacha. The first two he writes in halacha aleph, then he starts halacha base. It would seem that he should have included it in the previous halacha biyachadim beis rayis orishonis together with his first rayis. So that's the other question: why did the Rambam write it in its own halacha? In Ois Beis, the Rebbe introduces the idea that what the Rambam is trying to do is with the bringing down that it's part in the Orei Miklot to make the coming of Mashiach part of a mitzvah. And while all parts of Torah are indisputable, but a mitzvah has more force, and a mitzvah means literal, and this is what the Rambam is trying to point out of here. Base. So it appears to say that with this evidence from the Orei Miklot, yesh chidush ikri, there is a main novelty, something novel, legabe beis rayis orishonos, relative to the first two proofs. The fact that the Torah commanded, im yarchiv goimer v'yosafto goimer, that when Hashem will widen, you should make more Orei Miklot. There is a mitzvah to make 3 new Orei Miklot. When the days of Moshiach, we are obligated to add to the cities of refuge. B'lashon Rambam, using the language now that the Rambam says, quote, B'mei hamelech haMoshiach, that in the days of King Moshiach, moisifim sholesh achedes aleilu hashesh, we add 3 additionals over these 6. So by doing so, Nasaho inyan debiyas haMoshiach echod So then the idea of Mashiach becomes one of the condition of a mitzvah in the Torah. The Torah says that you make 3 new cities of refuge, and that's part of the conditions of Orei Miklat, that Orei Miklat has another 3 when Mashiach comes. Doesn't mean that it's not obvious and authentic before. Even though that the future redemption, it is explicit in the Torah. And the Rambam in the commentary on Mishnayos, he counts the belief in the future redemption amongst the principles and the foundations of the Torah. So, notwithstanding that, Mikol Mokoim still, as the Rebbe points out in the Har over here, that's why it's a principle, but it doesn't mean it's not part of the Amunah is not part of the mitzvahs of the Torah. But as the Rebbe explains the Orah, but therefore, Mikol Mokoim, so while it is clear in the Torah, the Geula, but Ein Ze Chelek Mitzvahs HaTorah, it's not part, the redemption is not part of the mitzvahs of the Torah. We don't find in the Torah Sivui Lahamin B'Hageula. We don't find Torah command. That's why the Rambam doesn't bring it down. This is a Sefer Hayad. It's Halacha. The Rambam doesn't bring it down because we don't find a command. There's no mitzvah to believe in the Geula. How do we know? Since it's something which is very clearly explicit in the Torah, therefore, anyone who doesn't believe in it, how do you kofer b'Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu? He is denying the Torah and our teacher Moshe. So it means that the concept that the Geula is coming is a Torah concept, but there is no mitzvah specifically to believe in the coming of Moshiach. But once we have this command, that when Hashem widens your place, then you add Orei Miklot, so then this future becomes part of the mitzvah of Orei Miklot. So that makes the idea, that concept of Geula, one of the details of the mitzvahs of the Torah. Through becoming a part of a mitzvah of the Torah, which means the coming of Moshiach becomes part of the mitzvah of Orei Miklot. Orei Miklot can be completed when there is the Geula. So then it gets that force that is in mitzvahs. There's a special force in mitzvahs. As the Rambam writes in the laws of the foundations of the Torah in the beginning of the Sefer Rambam Yad HaChazokah, this is where he writes it. This is clear and it's explicit in the Torah. That what shehi mitzvah emedes la'ad la'olam ul'olam elamim. That is a mitzvah that stands forever. Ein lo loy shinui veloy giroyin veloy tesafes. There isn't to a mitzvah no change. Mitzvah doesn't change. A mitzvah cannot be taken off, not diminished, and not extra loy tesafes. The mitzvah remains as it is. What is the meaning of mitzvah? Mitzvah pirushay sivuya Torah. Mitzvah means this is the command of the Torah. The commands of the Torah could be no change in them. As the Rambam continues, Shekol divrei, it's only say the Torah. Shekol divrei haTorah Mitzuvin onu la'asoisem ad olam. That all mitzvah of the Torah, we are instructed to do them forever. V'chein kosav gam b'ilchos malachim sham. And also the Rambam over there in Hilchos Malachim writes, Behemshech ha'inyan oides melech HaMashiach, when he writes about melech HaMashiach in the end of Halacha Gimel, that brings down, Iker hadvorim kochahim. So what's the main principle of these matters? The Rambam writes, this is the end of Perik Yud Aleph, and not the end of Halacha Gimel. That this Torah, its statutes, its laws, are forever and forever ever. You can't add to them and you can't take away from them. So he's talking about the chukim and mishpatim of this Torah are ever, are eternal. They cannot change this. So therefore, and the Rambam adds, one who should add or take away, or one who reveals an interpretation, an interpretation in Torah. He quotes, emphasizes, the Rambam says here, if he takes out the words, the matters of the mitzvah, he says they don't mean literally. For sure, that person is a badoi. And Beroshav Apikoidus. He is a evil and Apikoidus. A Badoi means somebody who is not true, made up person. He's false, he's a Rasha, and he's also a heretic, he's also an Apikoidus. So basically you see that mitzvahs have that special, that they're pshutim, the mitzvah means literally, and it also means, as the Rebbe will comment to play, it also means that it is forever. And therefore, since the concept of geula is a detail of the mitzvahs of the mitzvah orei miklot, so it becomes a part of the mitzvah orei miklot. It's kishem sha'orei miklot hi mitzvah emedes la'olam chulu ein lo l'shinu chulu. So just like the Orei Miklat itself, as we quote from before, it's a mitzvah. The Orei Miklat stands forever. There is no change. So Orei Miklat, the halacha of Orei Miklat stays all the time. So the details of the mitzvah, which is the coming of Moshiach, so there can also not be a change, God forbid, in the promise that there will be Yachshem Gevulcha. Move on Gam Diuk Loshna Rambam. And according to this, that we're saying that it's bringing a mitzvah, we understand the specific language that the Rambam uses, B'rayazu, when he brings the proof from Orei Miklot. He says, V'lo tziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Torah. Emphasize. The Rambam says he didn't command. A command needs to be carried through to the end in the simple context. Shekavanos l'hadgish, the Rambam's intent is to emphasize the key initial mitzvah, since it's an idea of a mitzvah, which is Tziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Harezeh Mechayev. So this, therefore, forces us to say, cannot be a change, because a command cannot be in vain. The Eibusha doesn't tell us a command which is not going to happen, and therefore this is part. Bias HaMashiach, the Archiv is part of this, so therefore it's going to definitely happen. It's a part of a mitzvah. That's what the Rambam adds in Halacha Beis with the proof from the Orei Miklot. In Ois Gimel, the Rebbe will explain the extra strength that a mitzvah has more than just something which is in the Torah or the promise of a Navi. Gimel, le'yaser bir, to explain this more. As far as promises that Hashem makes through a prophet, there are certain circumstances, certain cases, that it's possible that a change will take place. Say, for example, Divrei Hapur'onu Shanovi Omer, the punishment, the words of punishment that the prophet says, although the prophet says that Hashem said that the punishment is going to come, but still they can be nullified. Because Sha'kodesh Baruch Hu, quoting Erech Hapayim V'Rav Chesed, he prolongs his anger and his lots of kindness, or Ki Efsher She'asu Tshuva V'Nislach Lehem, maybe they did Tshuva and it was forgiven for them, as the Pirush HaMishnayis LaRambam, the Rebbe quotes here in number 22. So certainly we see that when God says through the Navi a punishment, it doesn't necessarily have to happen because Hashem might prolong his anger and perhaps maybe the people did Shuvah. But the same thing is, even if it was a promise for the good, if that wasn't public yet, but it was only between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the prophet, it's possible that should not be fulfilled if the sin causes a change, which is also in the Pirush Mishnayis to the Rambam over there. So from this it's understood. So we see that there is a change. Even when we are clear, we know for sure that the promise of the prophet will be fulfilled. Rambam, as the Rambam writes, that Shekol in Shekol Dover Toiva Sheyigzer Hakel Afilu Al Tanai Nechayzer, that any good item that Hashem decrees, even if it's conditional, it doesn't go back, which means it will always happen. As the Rambam explains in the commentary on the Mishnayis of the Rambam, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to a Navi to promise, tell the people a good Besurah, that must be fulfilled. Over here, you cannot take it away because there was a sin, and therefore we'll take away the promise, nullify the promise. No. So even in these cases, when we know when it's good, it was said, and Hashem needs to do it, so it's not because, by definition, a promise that is given to a prophet cannot be changed. No, a promise to a prophet could be changed, but there's circumstances are here that they're not going to be changed. In this case, these promises, there is no actual change because of Absurda Teva, as the Rambam says, that the reason why we don't change it is because the reason why we say that is so in order to be able to test somebody if he's a true Navi. The test for a true Navi is to ask him to say something in the future, and when it takes place, then we know that he's a true Navi. So we therefore have to say that his words have to become true. Otherwise, how are we going to test the Navi if they don't become true? Maybe there was a change, so it wouldn't be a proof that he's a Navi HaSheker if they don't come through. So therefore, certain promises have to take place because that's the way we test the Navi, and therefore they're going to take place. But it doesn't mean that they have a force. The prophecy of a Navi, by definition, doesn't have to come through. Some situations, they can change. But that only applies if it's a promise, a prophecy of a Navi. But when we talk about the eternity of Torah, which stands forever and ever, ever, that is because the Torah is not a changeable. It's not, cannot be defined by change. It is hainu she'i efsher she'yishtanu. It's not possible to change. It comes from a non-changeable place. Just like I, Hashem, quoting the pasuk, have not changed. There could be no change in Hashem, God forbid. Likewise, the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is which is the wisdom and the wishes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the whole definition of a change doesn't apply to it. Move on. So from this we also understand as far as the promise for the redemption. The promise that the Navi promises for redemption. Since, because it was a promise for the good, and this that Hashem has already said to the Navi, to promise the people with the good news. Still quoting from the Pirush HaMishnayos, it's not possible for it to be nullified because the sin may cause it. I said before, so it's not going to change because we know the promise for the good that was passed on to the people cannot be changed. In addition to that, there's another promise also. The Rebbe adds the bracket. From beginning with, we cannot apply in our case that there might be a change because the sin may cause change because Rambam, because as the Rambam uses the language, the Torah is already promised that in the end the Yidden will do tshuva in the end of Golus, and immediately they'll be redeemed. That's the beginning of the pasuk that we were quoting the whole time in Pashas Nitzavim. When all these things come upon you, you will return to God, your God, and then that Hashem will redeem you, bring you back. Hainu. So that means to say, not only will we promise redemption, we promise that will be tshuva, so there won't be a reason for not doing redemption. That we were promised that the Yidden will do tshuva, there's not going to be a circumstances that maybe it's not going to become true because the sin caused, because there's going to be no sin, because they're going to do tshuva. So we know for sure it's going to happen, because these conditions, it was in the Navi, and the Navi gave it over, it has to happen. In addition, the only reason why it would not happen is because of the sin. It says the Yidden are going to do tshuva. But yet, the certainty in this is only based on the definitions of prophecy and the way prophecy works. In other words, the Nevuah has certain situations, but Nevuah itself is not an unchangeable, could be sometimes changed. As opposed to through the fact that the promise of redemption, it becomes a part and a detail of the mitzvah of Torah. So on that detail, it applies, the eternity of Torah is on it. That's an eternity that to nullify it doesn't apply to it at all. As he said before, this is connected to Hashem, to the mitzvahs, which there's no change over there. By definition, there's no change. So when something is just said by a Navi, in essence, that could be changed if the circumstances are such. Something which is said by the Torah as a mitzvah, that cannot be changed. As the Rebbe will explain now in Ois Dalet, that there's also a difference about the eternity of Torah as it manifests itself when we say it's a mitzvah of the Torah, or it's just a story of the Torah. That even a story of the Torah doesn't necessarily have to be that it is literally. It can be a story of the Torah, it can be interpretations. But when there's a mitzvah needs to be literally. That's why it's more a mitzvah even than a promise or a fact which is written just in the Torah as a story. Ois Dalet, let's look inside. There is still room for a question. The rule that Torah is eternal is in all parts of Torah. And especially in the 5 chumashim of the Torah. As the Rambam writes, while other Nevi'im might be lost in love, there may be bottled, but Chamisha Chumshe Torah, Einom Betelim La'olam, the 5 chumashim of the Torah are never going to cease. Shekol HaNichtav B'Torahs Moshe, everything that was written in the Torah that Moshe gave us, who Nitzchi is eternal, V'Kayim La'olam, and stands forever. V'Im Kain, in that case, what does it help us that it's a mitzvah versus written in the Torah? Since the promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu for redemption is clear, articulated in Torah Moshe, so already to it applies the eternity of the 5 books of the Torah. What is added to this by saying that it's also part of the mitzvah of the Torah, not just part of the clear promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it becomes a mitzvah. We can say there is a main distinction between that eternity which is associated with the mitzvah of the Torah, to the eternity of the other parts of Torah Shebiksav. B'shar chelkei haTorah, in the other parts of the Torah, efsher she'inyan hanitzchis shebehem yiskayim lo kipshuto. It's possible that the eternity of Torah should be fulfilled, not literally, just in their spiritual contents. The stories of the Torah have a lesson in the spiritual meaning, not physical, because when we read about everything that took place, the history, those are lessons, those are teachings for us. The literal happened a long time ago. The chronicles and the stories of the written Torah, what is the eternity? What happened was a long time ago. So what is the eternity of the stories of the Torah? Those are the wisdom and the wonders that are hinted in the Torah. And not in their literal. The literal took place, that's the past, it's history. What is the lesson? What is the story? The story for us is a lesson. This already happened, so what are we going to... There's nothing to... The learning is not the physical, what took place, but it is the lesson and the message. But when we tell you that the Torah is a mitzvah, a medes, when we talk about a mitzvah, we say the mitzvah stands for eternally. That means which means the commands of the Torah, literally, the way it's simply understood, exist forever and ever, ever. Without any change, without any takeaway, without any additions. And the Rebbe said this is also in the Lashon Rambam. Haloshin, Lashon Rambam Maral, like the Rambam's exact Lashon is V'chol hamoisiv chulu v'hoitze advorim shel mitzvahs mipshutam, that anybody who adds and takes out the words of the mitzvahs, the Rambam emphasizes, the Rebbe bolds the mitzvah, the Rambam writes, if you take out mitzvah from pshutam, then for sure you're a badoy in the Rosh Hashanah. Meaning, mitzvahs have that special thing. If you take them out from the literal, this only applies when you say about mitzvah the Torah she'ena kipshuta, that they're not literally. Yesh olav geder zeh, then it applies to him, on that person is that definition, the Badoi of Rosh Apikoidus, that he is a Badoi and a Rosh Apikoidus, which is only because he says the mitzvahs are not literal. Then he's really denying the foundation of the eternity of Torah, that the mitzvahs are internal. But he would not be denying the eternity of Torah if he doesn't say the stories of Torah, Mashen Kain, as opposed to when he takes out the other meanings of the verses, takes them out literally, to him doesn't apply that definition that he's a Rosh Apikoidus, a Badoy and a Rosh Apikoidus. Okay, shame, just as in the story of Torah, same thing is with regards to the promises of Hashem, which were recorded, written in the Torah. That their actual fulfillment, that really depends on the way they were promised. They can hinge on the way the promise was, based on the conditions, based on the definition, as our sage of blessed memory interpreted. So it doesn't mean literally across the board. We need explanation what and where and how this is going to take place. And if the promise was written without these conditions, which means if it says conditions and you meet the conditions, then it has to mean literally, because you met the conditions. You can't get a promise and we say, oh, this condition. But if there's no conditions attached, then it doesn't literally have to take place, because it says in the Torah, but it doesn't mean literally. Again, if it hinges on conditions, and because the condition you fulfilled, then it has to be fulfilled literally. But if it doesn't hinge on conditions, just says it doesn't necessarily mean a promise that it means literally. As we find clearly, openly, that this rule, that when Hashem promises can sometimes not be fulfilled, in actuality, because the sin might cause, that would also apply to promises that are very clearly specified in the Torah. It quotes the Braisa says, two times. Until your nation passes by, until the nation, Amzukanisa. So we say, why is it two times Ad Yaver? So the Braisa says, Ad Yaver Amcho Hashem Zubi Yorishoino. That talks about the first time we came to Eretz Yisrael. When the first time through Yeshua. Shabol Arzme Yeshua, as Rashi says over there. Ad Yaver Amzukanisa, what is the second time? Zubi Yeshnia. That refers to the second time. Ad Yaver Amzukan Zubi Yeshnia. When they went up from the Golos Bavel in the day of Ezra. That's the Rashi says. So Mikan Omru Chachomim, but we know that the Aliyah in the second did not go so smoothly. That all the nation will wait and they'll stay there in awe. It was a different type. They got permission. Not everybody went up. It was a whole. So Mikan Omru Chachomim. Our Chachomim say that. That really they were fit to a miracle. The Torah equates the two, just like miraculously they went out the first time of Golus, of Mitzrayim. Same thing, they were also b'mei Ezra. They should have gone to very open in a miraculous way. Like it happened to Shub ben Nun, as the Pasuk says, the sin caused. So here we see the sin caused a change in the promise of Ad Yaver Amcha, Ad Yaver Amzukanisa. So one can argue, since this promise, Amzukanis has been written in the written Torah, before that was a promise before they came in the second time. Hashem promised them that there will be miracles there. But Torah, and this Torah cannot be exchanged. And there's no change, and there's no missing, and there's nothing to diminish, take away. We can't add. How are we possible to say that there's a change in this promise and it's not going to be fulfilled actually? Let it be for any reason. But it says in the Torah, it has to be no change. So we have to say, therefore, that this definition of Torah's eternity that does not generally apply to how we learn the meaning of the verses. In other words, when we say the eternity of Torah, doesn't mean the literal of the pasuk. It means the pasuk is eternity. Whether it's physically or spiritually, it's an all situation. It's conditional. Doesn't necessarily mean, because that doesn't impact. That doesn't say that it's not. It could be eternal, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any conditions. It doesn't mean that it's physically. It doesn't mean that it's in all circumstances. So that's why this is the chiddush when it comes to Moshiach's coming, that it becomes part of a mitzvah. Since the promise for redemption becomes a detail of the mitzvah or the miklot, so on it applies now the eternity of mitzvah of the Torah. Asher, when we talk about a mitzvah, so number one, aleph, muchrach lihiskayim, v'pashtus v'gasmis. It has to be fulfilled literally and physically. And number two, in such a way that there could be no change, like I said before. This is what the Rambam accomplished with Halacha Beis by bringing down the Orei Miklot, that Moshiach became part of a mitzvah, part of the mitzvah's Orei Miklot, and therefore it adds to the nitzchias and the certainty of the mitzvah in the coming of Moshiach. In Ois Hey, the Rebbe continues to make the case that the Rambam, by bringing in that the Mashiach belief is also a mitzvah, he makes the certainty that if you don't believe in it, it's much stronger than saying that you don't believe in the Torah. In order to be a kofer b'Torah fully, it has to be that the Mashiach is part of a mitzvah. Otherwise, if you don't agree to the interpretation or you have it's going against the Torah, but you can't say that that person is denying the Nitzchis HaTorah. He says it's not going to happen literally, it's going to be figuratively. But once we prove in Halacha Beis and Halacha that it's actually part of a mitzvah, then it's a totally different. Then if you're saying that it's not literally, then it becomes a gather of a kofer, and it's a very, that's what the Rambam wants to bring out, the seriousness of not believing in Mashiach. Hey, api kol anal yesh levayer, based on all the above, we can explain hatam sharambam meisif horaye al melech HaMashiach, the reason why the Rambam adds the proof on the melech HaMashiach maho, from the fact sha'af b'orei miklot hu omer, also by the Orei Miklot he says im yarchiv v'yosafto, and then you should add this never happened, and Hashem would not just instruct in vain. This is what does the Rambam mean to say here? The Rambam is not just bringing an additional proof, but he's bringing in a whole new concept, the idea of a mitzvah. In Kavonas Rambam, the intent of the Rambam is not the rak only. It's that too is another proof, but it's not only lahavi. to bring oid heichacha, another proof from the written Torah Chamisha Chumsha Torah Al Melech HaMashiach King Moshiach Elabola Hoisif Inyan Chodo. She comes to add a new concept in the seriousness of this matter of one who does believe. The noise of for in addition to the fact that he is denying Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, as the Rambam starts off the first halacha, that one who doesn't believe in him is denying the Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, because the Torah has testified upon him, and if you don't believe him, you're going to denying what the Torah said. Then you would be diminishing one of the mitzvahs of the Torah. Because if a person doesn't believe in Moshiach, this detail of the mitzvah of Orei Miklot, that there's going to be another 3 Orei Miklot when Moshiach comes, when there's going to be Yarchiv Hashem Gevulcha, Lo Yiskayim. He doesn't believe it's never going to happen. And therefore upon him applies what the Rambam writes, that one in the next halacha about one who doesn't believe in mitzvahs or says that there's a change. For sure he's a badoy in the Rosh Apikodos. So it only applied to him because we're saying that it's a mitzvah, and now he's denying the mitzvah. He said that's not going to happen. That's why the Rambam writes this as a proof in its own halacha. In the first 2 proofs, he intends to prove that he writes in halacha aleph, that you're denying the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu he idolo. Since the Torah testified, so if you disagree, then you're going against the Torah. This proof is coming to hint that there's an additional stringency in this matter. That you are actually taking away part of mitzvah Torah. So how does it make you worse being kofer b'Torah and making you from the first than making you Gerei mitzvahs? So imu kofer b'Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, you're already going ma moisiv zeh gerei mitzvah Torah. What does it add that we're saying that you're also diminishing from part of the mitzvah of the Torah? But the way we explained earlier, we can say that there's actually going to be a halachic difference between you're just denying kofer b'Torah the way it says in the Psukim in Halacha Aleph that the Rambam brings down, and the way if you're denying it because it's a mitzvah of the Torah. Ubahagdim biur dino shel ha'omer she'einu mamin begeula ha'asida lovei, and by first introducing to explain what would be the law of one who says, I don't believe in the future redemption, because he holds he says, although we were promised for redemption, so he's not denying that we weren't promised, he says we were promised. But he says, there was a change. And this promise has been nullified. Whether it's a sin or similar to the sin. So it would seem we can't say that he's denying the Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. He's not saying the Torah didn't say so. He's just saying Shara Torah Idolov because the Torah testified. He's not denying the Torah. But there we're saying Shakavonu Bazeh Shekoifer B'Dovram Furim Torah Sheksav. Over there, the intention is that he's denying something which says clearly in the written Torah. It says there's going to be the Geula, and he doesn't believe in it. But in this case, since he's saying there was a change, he's not denying a promise that is written in the Torah. But what he holds is he says also such a promise that says in the Torah Hashem could change his mind. He couldn't retract. So he's not denying what it said in the Torah, but he's denying the fact that there can be no change. But maybe we need to look. Maybe this would be a koifer denying the Torah, oral Torah, because the oral Torah says that that's what it means. That would be if it would only be because it's written in the Torah. But since the Geula is a detail and it's a definition in the midst of the Torah, with the mitzvah stands forever and ever, ever. This forces us to say that it's impossible to be, God forbid, a change in the promise of the Geula, because it's a mitzvah, and denying it is saying that the mitzvah is not going to happen. If he says opposite of this, then he has a din kof b'Torah. If he says it's not going to happen, even though he says Hashem changed his mind, because by mitzvahs you can't say such a thing. For although he believes that Hashem said, if Hashem will widen the place, you should bring it. Yes, he agrees to that. But when he says that this detail of the mitzvah is going to take place, that is not going to be another three other miklot, so then he was mevatel this Torah, and haru kof Torah, then it would be kofer in the Torah. So here we have a demonstration how we see that by the Rambam saying that it's also a mitzvah, that if somebody who said, I believe in what the Torah says, but I don't believe that it has to happen, it could be a change, that because it's the mitzvah of Torah, he would still be a kofer, because once it becomes a mitzvah of the Torah, there can be no change. We can say another difference. If he says he doesn't believe in the future redemption to come, because he explains the promises of the Torah promise, they don't mean literally. He says, for example, that this redemption will only take place spiritually. You can't say that he's denying the Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. He agrees. He admits that what the Torah said is true. But he holds he doesn't think that it means the literal matter, but it means not literally. So, similar to what we're saying in the previous case, he believes, but it says there's a change. In this case, he believes, but it says it doesn't mean literally. And even if you say that this is Hepech HaKlal, it goes against that a pasuk needs to go according to the literal sense. So we need to look in, is it possible to call him can we apply to him that definition, a name that he's a heretic in Torah, he's denying Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, because he's not directly denying it, but rather he's translating that it means something a little different. Just because he is explaining the verses, not literally, if we can actually apply to him that is a kof Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. But now the Rambam adds it's part of a mitzvah. But because of the fact that the redemption is a detail and part of the mitzvah of the Torah, then when he says that the Tegula is not going to be literally, then he's taking out the matter of the mitzvahs from the literal meaning. Then on him applies the din. What the Rambam writes is, if you take out the mitzvahs mipshutam, that he's definitely a badoy and the Rosh Apikoidus. And that's what's added, because the Rambam brings down also this additional proof from the mitzvah, that it's part of the mitzvah of the Orei Miklat. So now, along these lines of the Rebbe's explanation, the Rebbe continues in Ois Vav to tell us that actually Halacha Beis added, it's a mitzvah. But in Halacha Aleph, the Rambam adds that it's also violating the words of a Navi. Although it seems that the words of a Navi are less than the words of the Torah, the Rambam starts off, HaTorah Hidolov, and then we have Niba B'Shem HaMashiachim, Niba B'Shnei HaMashiachim, that in the prophecy of Bilam, there's a Nevuah. The Rebbe brings out that we're trying to say that there's actually a stringency in Nevuah, and what the Rambam is here saying in these two halachas, and Aleph and Beis, is that one who doesn't believe in Moshe Rabbeinu is actually denying all three things in the Torah, in the Navi, and also it's in a mitzvah. Let's look inside. Well, in this way, we can explain another diuk, an emphasis in the language of the Rambam. That in the evidence with Parshas Bilam, from the section of Bilam Omer, he says, Abbe Parshas Bilam Nemar, also in the portion of Bilam Nemar, and he says, Vishom Nibe. Over there he prophesied. Mishnei HaMashiachim, by the two Mashiach, David and Mashiach Tzidkei, Melech HaMashiach. So Rambam could have said that Parshas Bilam Nemar, Mishnei HaMashiachim. Why is he emphasizing Nibe? So l'cheda in a move on Tam Hadgosha Zu the Vishom Niba. Why does he have to emphasize that he prophesied? Shenemru b'derech nevuah, telling us that this was a prophecy. What would you think? It's not a prophecy. The Rebbe says, well, maybe Bilam is saying it's not a prophecy. So why would the Torah record what Bilam said? But the Rebbe said this is very difficult to explain. The Rambam wants to tell you Niba, Shekiv on Shemagdim Shezo b'Parshas Bilam. Since he introduces that this is in the section of Bilam, so he needs to add Vishom Niba, that he prophesied him loikein minolon sheyesh emes b'divrei Bilam. Yes, it's a prophecy, because otherwise, how do we know it's true to words of Bilam? Sharekiv on sheparshas Bilam nichtava b'Toras Moshe. We don't need a proof, because it's written. Portion of Bilam is written in Toras Moshe. Moving to Pasha, it's understood. It's obvious. Shedvorim amitim heim. These are true words. So the Rambam doesn't have to add the words Vishom Niba just to tell us that this prophecy that Bilam prophesied is true. There's another reason for it. So we can say Shekam Bozeh Kavonos Rambam that here too the Rambam's intent is to teach us an additional stringency. And one who doesn't believe in the Melech HaMashiach. In addition to the fact that he is denying the Torah and Moshe Rabbeinu, that's additional. Also, that Shom Niba, that this is Nevuah that he is denying. So you're going to ask, so what's the Chiddush? Why are we saying also Nevuah? If he's denying the Torah, Navi is not stronger. No, there is an aspect which the Navi is stronger. Although the words of Torah are more stringent than the word of Nevi'im, so what do we need to add? That you'll also be violating the words of the Navi after we said that you're violating the Torah? We also find a stringency in the words of Nevi'im, Devar Torah, words of Torah. If the Torah tells you to do something, or the words of Hashem, the mitzvahs, the words of Hashem, not all mitzvahs get the same punishment. But if a Navi tells you something and you defy it, then there's always the death penalty for that. Why? Because it's closer to the people, because a Navi is a human being which Hashem reveals himself to. So there's a moral connection there. So there's something about the Navi. Let's look inside. Although the words of Torah are more serious than the words of the Nevi'im, nevertheless, we find more also a stringency in the words of Torah relative to the words of Nevi'im, revert over the words of Torah. What's the punishment that comes if you violate what the Torah says? It depends on the category of the sin. It's a slight avera, a serious avera, get different punishment, different averas.
As opposed to if you violate the words of the Navi, but there's no difference what kind of a matter you violated. Even if it's matters that are optional, you are liable for misa b'dei shemayim. Always misa. Why? So we see that violating the words of a Navi carries itself a stringency even more than violating just regular the Torah. Why is that so? So we can say the reason, even though the force of words of the Torah is much greater than the force that is in the words of prophecy, nevertheless, relative to the people, there is a stringency in the words of prophecy. What is nevuah? That's Hashem is prophesizing human beings, not prophesying, not the Torah, but it's people that are prophesying. It's It's a idea, a knowledge that the Hashem shares, imparts to the heart of human beings. Since this is a revelation of Hashem's word to people, therefore acts of the human beings are more punishable, more connected, because Bnei Adam are telling you, and you're a Bnei Adam. So the words of the Nevi'im have a force and have a stringency relative to the words of Torah. Because of this, when a person hears a instruction, a command from the mouth of the prophet, it's as if you're hearing it from Hashem. And therefore, because you can relate to it more directly, Hashem is revealing himself through the Navi. Therefore, what the command doesn't matter. Hashem is saying something to you. If you are transgressing it, then you are violating, you're rebelling against the king, which is punishable by death. Leloi was guilty of death. Doesn't make a difference what you rebelled in, what the command was, what the instruction was. It is rebelling. Hashem told now through a human being what to do, and you rebelled against it. Move on. So from this we understand. So from this we understand that in generally there is a stringency of nevuah relative to words of Torah. Even when you're not also in a place where it does not apply, you're not violating the Divrei Navi. Now we're looking about it. Is it more serious because it was said by a Navi? Yeah. Because you didn't hear it directly from the Navi. So you would not be liable for death when you didn't hear it from the Navi. And yet there is that kind of stringency, because if you did hear it, that would be stronger. This is what the Rambam means when he writes, Vishom Niba. And over there he prophesies, Leram is to hint to us, that one who doesn't believe in the King Moshiach, also has this stringency that this is also a nevuah. So it's a nevuah, it's Torah and nevuah. So it turns out that we have all three things. We have the Torah, nevuah, and a mitzvah. It's a nimtzah. So it comes out according to this. And these three proofs that the Rambam brings. He teaches us that the concept of Melech HaMashiach, Nemar v'nichtav, has been said and written b'chol chelkei Torah shebiksav, in all sections of the written Torah. Hein b'sipurei v'avtochas haTorah. First in the stories and the promises of the Torah. That's in Parshas Nitzavim. Kimefurish Parshas Nitzavim, as articulated in the section of Nitzavim. Hein b'nevuas shebeTorah, and then again in the prophecies of Torah, Kimefurish Parshas Bilam, as says in Parshas, as explained, articulated in the portion of Bilam Sheshom Niba. Hein b'mitzvos shebeTorah, also mitzvah Torah, Kimefurish b'mitzvos Ari Miklot, as explained in the mitzvah of Ari Miklot. V'lochein, and therefore, one who doesn't believe in the King Moshiach, In addition to him being denying Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, he also denies the prophecy of the Torah. You're also denying the mitzvah of the Torah, which stands forever and ever and ever. So therefore, this is what the Rambam tells us here, that we have all the parts of the Torah, and one who doesn't believe in it is violating all of them. Finally, in Zion, the Rebbe is going to explain, so why was this mitzvah of Ori Miklat chosen to be the mitzvah in which the Moshiach hinges on that mitzvah? And the Rebbe is going to explain that cities of refuge is actually the time of Moshiach, is in time, the time of refuge in which we will be able to escape all of our Yetzer Hara and enjoy the Miklat. Zayin, Badayin Tzorich Bir, we still need explanation. My time and Nifchara Mitzvahs Orei Miklat. What's the reason that the city of the mitzvah of Orei Miklat was chosen? That the concept of Beis Mashiach becomes a detail in this mitzvah specifically. So we can say about this is in Yonam Shel Orei Miklat b'Pashtus. So what is the idea of Orei Miklat? Literally, Mokem Shmira v'Hagona Migoyel Hadam. It's a place of protection. It's a place that you're guarded and you're protected from the redeemer of the blood. Somebody killed somebody accidentally. The redeemer of the relative wants to kill him. If he wants to do Orei Miklat, he protects him there. So when the person, whether it was accidentally or even then he has to live there, or even Gambezodim, because they all go to Lechatchila Magdimim La'ar. First they go to the Orei Miklat. So Be'ir Miklat. So once you're in the Ir Miklat, then you can't touch him for bad. You can't touch him. Just as we have the escape in space, in the Orei Miklat, cities of refuge, likewise is also in time. There's a time of refuge. That's the Rambam says later on. It's that time. There's going to be no hunger, no war, no jealousy, no competition. So what's going to be? You will be able to have refuge from all matters that are no good. Of the time of exile. You'll be able to escape them. And the Yidden can sit secure on their land. Similar to this is also the spiritual matters. Especially the way it's known. That the concept of a series of refuge, the refuge to protecting you and the escape from the Yetzer Hara, he's called the Redeemer of the blood. He's seeking blood. He wants the person to fail. Chazal, as our sages, a blessed memory tell us, Divrei Torah koltim. The words of Torah, they are refuges. Just as a city of refuge, literally, it also serves as an atonement for the one who killed somebody. So likewise, it's also spiritually. When we talk about who killed somebody, that hints for an act of an aveda. You killed your nefesh elikis because al yoda poigem benafshe. Through this, you blemish your soul. So shedivrei Torah shalemdim, through the limit Torah that you learn, divrei Torah koltim poilim klita v'kapor lenafshe. They impact a refuge and atonement for your soul. That's the connection of the mitzvah or a miklat to the coming of Melech HaMashiach. Because Melech HaMashiach took more klitosom, then it will be completed the refuge, the kaporos and shal Yisrael, and the atonement of the Yidden, b'mheira v'yameinu mamish, speedily in our days. This is Mesichas Shabbos Devarim, Rosh Chodesh Elul Tovshin and Vav, Motzei Shabbos Parshas Pinchas Tovshin Lamed Ches.